Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so our screencast for today is really going to focus on a specific rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion that takes place in Colonial, Virginia in the year 1676. And really what we're going to kind of focus on is like kind of why it happened, but then also we're going to put more focus on kind of like the after effects of it and what it leads to, because really what this is going to kind of lead to is a transition from this system of indentured servitude, which we kind of got introduced to, when we started to talk about Virginia, and then kind of moving into African slavery. And so we're going to kind of evaluate what role you think Bacon's Rebellion plays in the shift that took place in colonial labor systems. So we're going to kind of jump into it. And first, I think the first important thing to kind of understand here is to take a look at the colonies and to look at things in a little bit different light. So we just kind of got finished going through kind of an analysis and a description and kind of understanding of the different colonial regions. And we looked at the New England colonies. Principally, we focused on Massachusetts Bay Colony. We looked at the Southern colonies and we focused on the Chesapeake Bay colonies. And we looked at the Middle colonies and kind of focused on Pennsylvania. Now, that's kind of like the traditional way to look at colonial British America. And it's probably the way you learned about in elementary school and maybe middle school, kind of looking at the three colonial regions and kind of seeing how they develop differently, what are their characteristics religiously, socially, economically, and kind of being able to compare them. So that's definitely something in our class that you have to be able to do, to be able to look at these three regions, New England, Middle, Southern colonies, and see like what do they share in common? What are major differences of these different three colonial regions? Now, in our class, we also have to layer in a different way of looking at the colonies, which I think is also very insightful to kind of get the inner dynamics of what's really happening in colonial British America. So the second way to kind of look at it is not dividing it by New England, Middle, and Southern, but instead dividing kind of all of the British colonies by people who live in the eastern half of the colony and people who live in the western half of the colony. And it's very interesting when you look at the colonies in that fashion, you get a different kind of perspective on some of the things that are happening in colonial America. And that's going to come up today with Bacon's Rebellion a little bit. So when you look at it in the eastern part of the colony, we're going to call these people who live in the eastern part of the colony the coastal people. And the people who live in the west refer to these people as the coastal elites. Because they kind of control a lot of the different powerful positions within the colonies. They have a lot of big land-owning farms. Economically, they have big plantations. And so like the Western people call these people the coastal elites. Now, if you look at them ethnically, they tend to be predominantly English, who are people who are kind of living along the coast. Now, if you look at the western part of the colonies, we're going to refer to the people who live in the western part of the colonies as people who live in the back country. And people who live in the back country, it's referred to the back country simply because it's like the western part of the colonies, and it's kind of like they're being pushed out into like this back kind of wilderness country where they live. And if you look at them ethnically, one of the interesting things is that you have a lot of different ethnic immigrant groups kind of living out in the back country. So one of the things you want to note down about the back country is that immigrants in colonial America, we often think of immigrants as moving into inner cities and living in cities. A lot of immigrants in colonial America from non-English backgrounds end up kind of out in the backcountry part of the colonies because it's less desirable land. And so that's, I think, kind of an interesting dynamic. So one of the things you want to note down is just that, yeah, we can compare the colonies New England, Middle, and Southern, but you can also compare the colonies eastern, like coastal elites and eastern people, and western people. And this idea and this kind of comparison or this kind of analysis of the colonies definitely comes up in the rebellion we're going to talk about today called Bacon's Rebellion. So the leader of this rebellion that breaks out in colonial Virginia in 1676 is a man named Nathaniel Bacon. And Bacon happens to be one of our backcountry settlers. He lives in the western part of the colony. Now, the backcountry is not all different immigrant groups. You have English people who are living out in the backcountry as well. But there's important characteristics to kind of know about people who are living in this western part of the colony. First off, like I said, there's more ethnic diversity in a lot of different groups out there. But I think the really important things to note about them is that these people who live in the Western colonies, they kind of feel like they are not fully protected out in the West, and they feel like the people in the East are almost kind of using them as like a buffer between the Eastern settlements and the Native American settlements, and Native American tribes who are kind of living, in these same regions. And so like life in the backcountry is very different than life in the coast. You're constantly coming into conflict with Native American tribes because the settlers are trying to move westward. The Native Americans are trying to stop them from moving westward. There's constant raids going back and forth between Western settlers and the Native Americans. And, essentially these backcountry settlers kind of look to the people in the East and kind of feel like they're not being supported. They're not being, given military to kind of support them in, their conflicts. The other thing that a lot of Westerners kind of feel is that they're not fully represented by these colonial governments. A lot of them might not meet the specific land requirements to be able to vote or to hold office. And so like a lot of them kind of feel like maybe they're not being fully represented. So there's some tension between Western settlers and Eastern coastal people in these colonial regions. So when you look specifically at Virginia and Southern colonies, one of the things to kind of note down is that a lot of the people who end up moving out there in Virginia and in a lot of the Southern colonies are former indentured servants. And so like these were people who were coming over as these contract servants, these contract workers, and working on these plantations in this form of servitude. Once they get their freedom, they're given something called freedom dues, which they would get a piece of land and usually a weapon, and they would a lot of times send them out to these western frontier parts of the colonies. So there, in the broader kind of picture here, there's really two sources of tension to kind of be aware of. There's tension between the Western backcountry settlers and Native American tribes living in the West, but there's also tension between the backcountry settlers and, the Eastern colonies. And you definitely see this with Bacon's rebellion. So Bacon kind of creates this rebellion. First, they're getting into conflicts with the Native Americans. So they first kind of turn their anger on Native Americans living kind of in this Western frontier region. And they after they go in and really massacre, friendly and, non-friendly Native American tribes, they then turn their anger on Virginia, the colony itself. So Bacon kind of marches his militia and his army towards the capital, Jamestown. They burn Jamestown to the ground. The governor, William Berkeley, has to flee Virginia. Now, eventually, the rebellion kind of dissipates, and essentially, if it wasn't for kind of like the change that happened, we really wouldn't be focusing too much on Bacon's rebellion. But really, the after effect of the rebellion, I think, is the key to kind of understanding like the importance of it. So when you look at what happens in the after effect of Bacon's rebellion is happening here in 1676. Now, this is showing you populations in the southern colonies during the time period. And the thing that you should kind of stand out to you is, look at the population of African Americans and what happens, after this rebellion takes place. The population of African Americans skyrockets. And really what that means is the enslaved population in the southern colonies is going to start to increase. Now, what we have to kind of think about and we have to analyze is, why did that take place? I think a lot of times people just kind of assume that it's because of Bacon's rebellion that, they're going to turn away from indentured servants, because a lot of these people were former indentured servants and they're going to turn to a different form of forced labor in African slavery. Now, that's not necessarily the truth. We have to kind of analyze it in different ways. What is definitely true is that in the late 1600s, early 1700s, they're going to slowly start to transition away from indentured servitude and into African slavery. And that's not like an immediate thing. It's not like they stop indentured servitude completely and just shift over to African slavery. It's kind of like happens over 50, 60, 70 years. And they slowly transition away from indentured servitude and kind of bring in and import more and more slaves into the New World. Now, what we have to kind of analyze a little bit is why did this happen? So one reason potentially is Bacon's rebellion, that your more wealthy colonists, your coastal elites, as the backcountry would have called them, were nervous about future rebellions by former indentured servants who might hold a grudge against their former masters. They now have their freedom out in the backcountry. They feel like they're not being protected by the Eastern colonists, and therefore they might turn on the colony and turn on, the leaders of the colony in the future. And so maybe that leads them to wanting a more permanent system of slavery within the British colonies. That's one potential reason. What we have to think about are what are some other potential reasons for this. So I think the other big potential reason that's kind of out there is that things are changing in Europe at the time as well. The source of indentured servants are poor English and Irish and Scottish people in Europe. And what's happening is that the economy is also improving at the same time in England. So your source of indentured servants are not as available at the same time that this is kind of happening. So that's also kind of playing into like whether they're going to shift away from indentured servitude or not. The other thing that's happening is that Spain is declining as a power, and they've been declining at this point for about a century after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. And so like they're kind of on their way out at this point as a major global presence. And so essentially, this is opening a door for the British to kind of get more involved in the slave trade than they could have before, because the Spanish and the Portuguese and to a certain extent the Dutch kind of dominated this slave trade. And so now the British can kind of work their way in and be able to kind of access African slavery in a way that they wouldn't have been able to access it, let's say, a century earlier. So in our class, you kind of have to evaluate it and say like, well, how big of a role did Bacon's Rebellion play? Is it more than these other factors? Less than these other factors? And that's going to be kind of a question I'm going to ask you guys to weigh in on, as part of this assignment that we're going to do as part of your homework. Now, what definitely kind of results, whether you think it's Bacon's Rebellion or you think it's the decline of the Spanish Empire, or you think it's, a better economy in Britain, whatever you think is the major factor for why this happens, there's definitely a growth of African slavery within North America. Now, when you look at the grand picture here, overall, there's a lot less slaves being imported into British colonial America than there is into the Caribbean and South America. So that has a lot to do, I think, with climate and as far as the need for the amount of slaves that need to be brought into these plantations in the Caribbean and South America. And that really is true even in the British colonies. When you look at the amount of slaves imported into the British Caribbean islands, it dwarfs the amount that are brought into the southern British colonies. But nevertheless, what we're going to kind of focus on is more kind of the impact that this transition has. So you have large amounts of Africans being brought into the New World for plantation labor. Now, if you look, I think a couple things. Then the next screencast, we're going to kind of focus on how it's not just the southern colonies. It's also the middle colonies that have some slavery and also the New England colonies. And if you notice here, to a lot smaller degree, but they do exist. So we're going to talk in our next screencast about the differences in these different colonial regions. The Chesapeake Bay as compared to slavery in the middle colonies or the northern colonies of New England and how they're different. But what we have to kind of focus on is like, what does this mean for the societies? And I think for the societies, what this means is, number one, as we said, a shift in the type of labor. So we're going to a permanent form of slavery kind of being brought into these societies. And that starts with like the lower South, which right from the beginning, they kind of bring this mentality. And then in Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay, they kind of shift over. Now, I'm not going to read through these specific slave excerpts from the slave codes with you. You can kind of pause the video and read it on your own. I'm just going to kind of offer you a little bit of analysis that I think is important. What you see happening here, I think, are two things with these slave codes. First thing, they start to implement kind of special laws specifically for slaves. And what you'll notice, the language that they use, they're going to kind of interchangeably use slave with the term Negro. And so it's becoming racially based, and it's becoming hereditary, which we'll get into in our next screencast a little bit further. And the second quote shows that converting to Christianity does not change the status of a slave in Virginia.